The morning mist clung to the valley like forgotten dreams when Jake Sullivan pushed open the heavy wooden doors of his grandfather's old feed store. He expected to find empty shelves and decades of dust, maybe a family of raccoons who'd made themselves comfortable in the grain bins. What he didn't expect was a woman sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully unwrapping a tiny red scarf from around a white duck's neck while two identical little girls watched with the kind of fascination reserved for magic tricks. The duck, perfectly still and oddly dignified, seemed to understand the importance of the moment. One of the girls, maybe 4 years old with copper-colored curls that caught the filtered sunlight, whispered something that sounded like encouragement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her twin mirror image, except for a small scar above her left eyebrow, nodded seriously and reached out to stroke the duck's feathers with a gentleness that spoke of practice. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, coffee mug halfway to his lips, wondering if he'd somehow walked into someone else's life by mistake. The woman looked up at the sound of his boots on the creaky floorboards and her hands stilled. She had the kind of eyes that held too many stories, green like sage in sunlight, and they widened with something between surprise and panic. "I can explain," she said quickly, her voice carrying a slight tremor that made Jake think of birds with broken wings. The door was unlocked and it was raining, and Duchess here, she gets cold easily because of her condition, and the girls were so tired, and I thought maybe just for a few hours. She was rambling, Jake realized, the way people do when they're preparing to run. The duck, apparently named Duchess, waddled closer to the children as if sensing tension. The little girls pressed against their mother or whoever she was, creating a protective circle that spoke of experience with uncertain situations. "The scarf," Jake said finally, because it seemed like the most reasonable place to start a conversation that had no reasonable beginning. "The duck's wearing a scarf." The woman's cheeks flushed pink. "She has a respiratory condition. The vet said to keep her warm and dry. I know it sounds ridiculous, but she's been with us since the girls were babies, and they've been through enough without losing." She stopped herself, clamping her lips shut as if she'd revealed too much. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, studying the scene. The woman wore clothes that had seen better days, a denim jacket too large for her frame over a faded green dress that hung loose around her thin shoulders. The girls were clean, but their clothes were patched and mended with the kind of care that came from necessity rather than choice. "Does she swim?" Jake asked. "What? The duck, does she swim?" "Because I was about to sit down with my coffee, and if she's planning to take a dip, I'd rather know up front." The woman blinked, clearly not understanding where this conversation was heading. One of the little girls giggled, a sound like wind chimes on a summer porch. "Duchess doesn't like water," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "She thinks she's people." Jake crouched down to the child's level, balancing his coffee mug carefully. "Is that right? Well, that's interesting. Most ducks I know are pretty fond of water. What makes Duchess different?" The second twin, the one with the scar, spoke up with the grave seriousness that only small children can manage. "She was sick when she was little. Mama saved her from mean people who didn't feed her right. Now she thinks Mama is her mama duck." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That explains the scar. Can't have a sick duck catching cold in a drafty old place like this." The woman was watching him with growing confusion, as if she couldn't quite figure out whether he was mocking them or genuinely interested. Jake stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and looked around the space that had once been his grandfather's pride and joy. Sunlight streamed through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny spirits. The shelves stood empty except for a few forgotten items, rusty tools and faded seed packets that spoke of dreams planted and abandoned. In the back corner, someone had spread out a collection of blankets with the kind of precision that suggested military training or survival instinct. "I'm Jake," he said, extending his hand to the woman. "Jake Sullivan. This is my grandfather's place. Was anyway. He passed last winter." She hesitated before taking his hand, her grip firm despite the tremor he'd heard in her voice. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Mitchell. These are my daughters, Emma and Ella. Nice to meet you, Sarah Mitchell." Jake kept his tone casual, friendly, the way he might greet a neighbor at the post office. "And you too, Emma and Ella. Can't forget Duchess, of course." As if summoned by her name, the duck waddled over to Jake's boots and began investigating them with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. She made soft clucking sounds that seemed almost conversational. "She likes you," Emma said, or maybe it was Ella. Jake was going to have to work on telling them apart. "She doesn't usually like strangers." "Well, I'm honored," Jake said, and found that he meant it. Though I have to ask, Sarah, what brings you and your unusual family to Cedar Falls? We don't get many visitors, especially ones traveling with waterfowl. The guarded look returned to Sarah's eyes, and she pulled the girls a little closer. We were just passing through, looking for somewhere quiet to rest for a day or two. I can pay you for the use of the space. I have some money saved. Something in the way she said it, the careful pride mixed with desperation, told Jake more than her words did. This wasn't a woman on vacation with her children and pet duck. This was someone running from something, someone who'd learned to expect the worst from strangers and plan for quick exits. Tell you what, Jake said, setting his coffee mug down on one of the empty shelves. I was planning to spend the morning going through this place, figuring out what's worth keeping and what needs to go. Could use some help, if you're not in a hurry to get back on the road. Sarah's eyebrows drew together in suspicion. Help how? Nothing complicated. Sorting through boxes, maybe sweeping up some of the dust. The girls could help too if they want. Duchess can supervise. As if understanding her role, the duck settled herself in a patch of sunlight and began preening her feathers with an air of importance. The twins looked at their mother with hopeful expressions. We could help, Ella said. The one with the scar. We're good helpers. Very good helpers, Emma agreed. And Duchess knows how to find lost things. Jake looked at Sarah, waiting for her decision. He could see the internal battle playing out across her face, caution warring with what might have been relief at the prospect of staying in one place, even temporarily. I don't want charity, she said, finally. Good, I don't give charity. I pay fair wages for fair work. $1 an hour for you, 50 cents each for the girls. Duchess works for free, but she gets lunch. Sarah's mouth almost smiled at that. Almost. What kind of lunch does a duck eat? Corn. Maybe some lettuce if she's lucky. I think there's still some feed in the back room, probably stale, but Duchess doesn't strike me as the picky type. This time Sarah did smile, just a little. She's not. All right, Mr. Sullivan, we'll help for the morning, but just the morning, Jake, he corrected. And just the morning is fine. We'll see how it goes. The feed store had been Walter Sullivan's life for 43 years before arthritis and stubbornness finally convinced him to close the doors. Jake remembered coming here as a boy, climbing on stacks of grain sacks while his grandfather measured out feed for customers who paid as much with stories and gossip as they did with money. The old man had possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every farm and ranch within 50 miles, knew which horses had colic and which farmers were struggling with their mortgages. Now the place felt hollow, like a church after the congregation had moved on. Jake had been putting off this task for months, telling himself he was too busy with his veterinary practice in town. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He wasn't ready to let go of the last connection to the grandfather who'd raised him after his parents died. But watching Sarah and the twins explore the space with careful curiosity, he found himself seeing it through their eyes. Emma discovered an old scale that still worked, delighting in the way the metal weights made satisfying clicking sounds when she arranged them. Ella found a dusty jar full of marbles that had probably been sitting on the same shelf since the Eisenhower administration. Even Duchess seemed interested in her surroundings, investigating corners and crevices with the thoroughness of a detective. Sarah moved differently than her daughters, he noticed. Where they explored with the natural curiosity of children, she catalogued exits and hiding spots with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to always have an escape plan. She kept the girls within arm's reach, never fully relaxing, even as they began to settle into the rhythm of simple tasks. There's a whole box of children's books back here, Sarah called from behind the counter. Looks like someone was collecting them. Jake wandered over to investigate. Sure enough, a cardboard box held dozens of picture books, their covers faded but pages intact. My grandmother's doing, probably. She used to run a little lending library out of here for families who couldn't make it to town. Kids would trade one book for another. Can we look? Emma asked, already reaching toward the box with the magnetic pull children had toward stories. Sure thing, just be gentle with them. Some of those books are older than your mom. Sarah shot him a look that might have been amusement or annoyance. I'm not that young, Mr. Sullivan. Jake, he reminded her, and I wasn't implying anything about your age. Some of those books date back to the 50s. My grandmother never threw away a book in her life. The twins settled cross-legged on the floor with a selection of picture books, taking turns reading to each other in the way children do, making up words they didn't know and creating elaborate explanations for the pictures. Duchess positioned herself between them like a feathered bookmark. occasionally reaching out with her bill to turn pages. She really does think she's people, Jake observed. Sarah had begun sorting through a box of old receipts, creating neat piles of papers to keep and papers to throw away. She was barely alive when we found her. Someone had dumped her in a parking lot during a thunderstorm, just a tiny duckling with a respiratory infection and a broken wing. The girls named her Princess at first, but when she got better and started acting so dignified, Emma decided she needed a more royal name. How long ago was that? 3 years. Right after Sarah stopped herself, the same way she had earlier. Jake was beginning to recognize the pattern, the way she caught herself before revealing too much about their past. He didn't push, instead he opened another box and began examining its contents, giving her space to decide how much she wanted to share. The box contained his grandfather's collection of veterinary supplies, bottles of medicine and tools that Jake recognized from his own practice. Your grandfather was a vet too? Sarah asked, noticing his familiarity with the items. No, but he might as well have been. Couldn't afford to call the doc for every sick animal, so he learned to handle most things himself. Taught me everything I know about treating livestock before I ever set foot in vet school. Sarah looked up from her sorting. You're a veterinarian. Guilty as charged. Got a practice in town, mostly large animals, horses, cattle, the occasional exotic pet. Had a farmer bring me a sick peacock last month. Never thought I'd need to know peacock medicine, but here we are. Could you look at Duchess? The question came out in a rush, as if Sarah had been holding it back. I mean, if you have time. She's been wheezing a little more lately, and I've been giving her the medicine the last vet prescribed, but that was 6 months ago, and I'm not sure if I should keep. Of course, Jake interrupted gently. I'd be happy to take a look at her. No charge for friends. Sarah's hand stilled on the papers she'd been sorting. We're not friends, Mr. Sullivan. We just met an hour ago. Jake, he corrected again. And you're right, we're not friends yet. But Duchess might be willing to put in a good word for me if I help with her breathing. As if she understood the conversation, the duck looked up from the book she'd been supervising, and made a soft sound that could have been agreement or commentary. Ish. Noters, but course for, Jeruk bin to make was seb pris. Oh, sil thurs, ver pris, but course, but course, but course, but course, but e. But e. But course, 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 but course. Emma giggled and scratched under Duchess's chin. She says okay, Emma translated. But she wants to finish this story first.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jake glanced at the book. What story is she reading? It's about a little bird who gets lost and has to find her way home, Ella explained solemnly. But all the other birds look different than her, so she doesn't know where she belongs. The parallel wasn't lost on any of the adults in the room. Sarah's cheeks flushed again, and she focused intently on her sorting. Jake pretended not to notice the way her hands trembled slightly as she handled the papers. How does it end? He asked. She finds a place where being different is okay, Emma said. And the other animals there are different too, so they all belong together. That sounds like a good ending. It's our favorite story, Ella added. Mama reads it to us almost every night. Jake looked around the feed store, imagining what it might look like with some life breathed back into it. The building was sound, better constructed than most modern places. The location was good, right on Main Street with parking and easy access. With some work, it could be something useful again. Sarah, he said, making a decision that surprised him with its suddenness. What would you say to staying more than just the morning? She looked up sharply, suspicion flaring in her green eyes. What do you mean? I mean, this place needs more than a morning's work to get it ready for whatever comes next. Could take weeks to go through everything properly. And honestly, I could use the help. My practice keeps me busy. But this was important to my grandfather. I want to do it right. I told you I don't take charity, and I told you I don't give charity. I'm talking about a job. Real work, fair pay, and a place to stay while you do it. He gestured toward the back of the store, where a set of stairs led to what had once been a small apartment. Upstairs is furnished, basic, but clean. My grandmother lived there for a while after my grandfather died. Sarah was shaking her head before he finished speaking. We can't. I mean, it's generous, but we're not staying in Cedar Falls. We're traveling. Where to? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Jake waited, sipping his coffee and listening to the twins argue gently over whether the lost bird in their story was brave or just lucky. "I don't know," Sarah admitted finally, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "Somewhere safe." Safe from what? But she'd already said more than she intended. The walls came back up, visible in the way she straightened her shoulders and gathered the girls closer to her. "We should go," she said, standing abruptly. "Come on, girls. Pack up the book." "But we haven't finished helping," Emma protested. And Jake was going to look at Duchess. "Another time, sweetheart." Jake watched the familiar dance of departure, the way Sarah moved with practiced efficiency to gather their few belongings. The twins obeyed but reluctantly, their disappointment clear in every movement. Even Duchess seemed to sense the change in mood, fluffing her feathers and making worried sounds. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. "Whatever you're running from, Cedar Falls is about as safe as it gets. Population 800 on a good day, one sheriff who's 73 and mostly concerned with teenagers parking where they shouldn't. Nearest big city is 3 hours away." She paused in her packing, not looking at him. "You don't understand, then help me understand." For a moment he thought she might. Something in her posture shifted, and she turned toward him with an expression that held equal parts longing and fear. But then one of the twins dropped a book, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had been building. "I can't," she said simply. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Jake nodded, disappointed but not entirely surprised. "I understand, but the offer stands, if you change your mind. I'll be here most mornings this week, working on the cleanup." Sarah bundled the girls toward the door, Duchess waddling behind them with as much dignity as a duck wearing a red scarf could manage. At the threshold she turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for treating us like people instead of problems." "You are people," Jake replied. "Good people from what I can tell. And Duchess is excellent people too." That almost smile flickered across Sarah's face again. "She thinks so." Then they were gone, leaving Jake alone in the dusty feed store with his coffee and more questions than answers. He stood in the doorway and watched them walk down Main Street. Sarah's hand on each girl's shoulder, Duchess following at their heels like a small feathered guardian. They didn't have a car, he realized. Whatever their story was, wherever they'd come from, they were traveling on foot with nothing but what they could carry. The thought bothered him more than it should have, considering he'd known them for less than 2 hours. Jake had always been the type to collect stray. As a boy he'd brought home injured birds and orphaned kittens, much to his grandmother's alternating delight and exasperation. In vet school, he'd been the one his classmates called when they found animals that needed home. His grandfather used to joke that Jake had never met a creature he couldn't love, given enough time. But this felt different. Sarah and her unusual family weren't just passing through his life, they were walking away from it, and the distinction mattered in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He spent the rest of the morning sorting through boxes and trying not to think about green eyes and copper-haired twins and a duck who thought she was people. By noon he'd made good progress on the front section of the store, creating neat piles of items to keep, donate or throw away. The books Sarah had found were definitely keepers. He'd donate them to the new library in town, let another generation of children discover the magic his grandmother had believed in. The old scale would go to the Historical Society, along with some of the vintage feed advertisements and farming implements. But it was the small personal items that gave him pause. His grandfather's reading glasses, worn smooth from decades of use. A coffee mug with "World's Best Grandpa" painted in child's handwriting. A Father's Day gift from Jake when he was 7. A photograph tucked into the cash register drawer, showing Walter and his wife Margaret on their wedding day. Young and hopeful and completely unaware of what life would bring them. Jake sat on the front step with his grandfather's coffee mug and a sandwich from the deli down the street, watching the slow rhythm of small-town life play out before him. Mrs. Henderson walked her ancient basset hound past the store, pausing to wave through the window. The mailman stopped to chat with the owner of the hardware store across the street. A few teenagers on bikes rode by, probably heading to the swimming hole outside town. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that made Jake grateful he'd chosen to stay in Cedar Falls after vet school instead of moving to one of the bigger cities where the money was better. This was home in the truest sense. The place where people knew your story and cared about your problems and showed up with casseroles when life got complicated. Which made him wonder, not for the first time, what kind of problems could drive a woman and 2 small children to wander the countryside with nothing but a sick duck for company. He was still pondering that question when he saw them coming back up the street. Sarah walked with the careful pace of someone trying not to look hurried. The twins skipping ahead of her with the resilient energy of children who could find adventure in a grocery store parking lot. Duchess brought up the rear, her red scarf slightly askew but her dignity intact. They stopped in front of the feed store, and Jake watched through the window as Sarah seemed to gather her courage.
Finally, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. "The job offer," she said without preamble. "Does it come with medical coverage?" Jake looked at Duchess, who was wheezing slightly after the walk. "For the duck, for all of us. I mean, if something happened, if one of the girls got hurt or Duchess needed emergency care." "Sarah," Jake interrupted gently, "if you work for me, your family, and family takes care of family." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to determine whether he meant what he said. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. 2 weeks, she said. "We'll stay for 2 weeks and help you clean out the store, but then we move on." 2 weeks, Jake agreed, though he suspected that once Sarah and the twins settled into the rhythm of Cedar Falls life, leaving might prove more difficult than arriving had been. The twins cheered and immediately began planning how they would arrange the upstairs apartment. Duchess waddled over to her favorite spot by the window and settled down with the air of someone who had just made an important decision. Jake looked at his grandfather's photograph still propped on the counter where he'd left it. Walter Sullivan had believed in taking care of people, in offering second chances and safe harbors to those who needed them. If he could see his grandson now, making room in his life for a woman and twins and a duck in a scarf, Jake thought the old man would approve. "Well then," Jake said, standing and dusting off his hands. "Let's get you settled in. And then maybe we can take a look at Dutch, see if we can't help her breathe a little easier." Sarah nodded, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked less like someone preparing to run and more like someone considering the possibility of staying still. Outside, Cedar Falls continued its peaceful afternoon routine, unaware that its population had just increased by 2 3/4 if you counted the duck. But Jake counted the duck, and as he watched Sarah and the twins explore their temporary home, he found himself hoping that 2 weeks might stretch into something longer. After all, Duchess hadn't tried to swim in his coffee yet, and that seemed like a promising start. The apartment above the feed store hadn't been lived in for 3 years, but Jake's grandmother had kept it clean and ready, as if she'd known someday it would shelter people who needed a safe place to land. Sarah stood in the middle of the small living room, turning slowly to take in the faded floral wallpaper, the sturdy oak furniture and the windows that looked out over Main Street like watchful eyes. Emma and Ella had already claimed the smaller bedroom, spreading their few belongings across the twin beds with the territorial enthusiasm of children who rarely had space to call their own. Their voices carried through the thin walls as they debated which bed was closer to the window and whether Duchess would prefer to sleep on the braided rug or the wooden chair by the dresser. Duchess herself had taken up residence in a patch of afternoon sunlight near the kitchen window, her red scarf neatly folded beside her as she preened her feathers with the methodical precision of someone settling in for a long stay. The wheezing sound that had worried Sarah seemed less pronounced in the quiet apartment, as if the duck too could breathe easier away from the uncertainty of the road. Jake had left them alone to get acquainted with their temporary home, promising to return in the evening with groceries and a proper examination of Duchess's respiratory issues. Sarah appreciated his tact in recognizing that they needed space to decompress, to shed the hypervigilance that came from weeks of sleeping in unfamiliar places and trusting no one. She opened the refrigerator and found it stocked with basics: milk, eggs, butter, bread and a covered casserole dish with a note attached in spidery handwriting. "Welcome to Cedar Falls. Heat at 350 for 20 minutes. Love, Mrs. Henderson." Sarah smiled despite herself. In her experience, kindness from strangers usually came with strings attached, but this felt different. Uncomplicated. The bathroom was small but functional, with a clawfoot tub that made Sarah's heart ache with longing. It had been months since any of them had enjoyed a proper bath, relying instead on quick showers in truck stops and gas stations, always listening for footsteps that might signal danger. Tonight, she decided, the girls would have bubbles and warm water and all the time they needed to remember what it felt like to be children instead of refugees. A soft knock at the door interrupted her planning. Sarah's body tensed automatically, her hand moving instinctively to the kitchen drawer where she'd already located the largest knife. But then she heard Jake's voice calling her name, and the familiar weight in her chest eased slightly. "Come in," she called back, not moving away from the drawer entirely, but allowing her shoulders to drop from their defensive posture. Jake entered carrying 2 bags of groceries and what appeared to be a small veterinary kit. His presence filled the apartment without overwhelming it, a trick that Sarah suspected came from years of entering other people's spaces to care for their animals. He moved with the careful respect of someone who understood that home was sacred, even when it was temporary. "How's everyone settling in?" he asked, setting the groceries on the small kitchen table. "The girls love it," Sarah replied, which was true but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she loved it too, loved the solid walls and the lock on the door and the way the afternoon light made everything look golden and safe. But loving something meant becoming attached to it, and attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford. "And Sarah considered the question, unpacking groceries to avoid meeting his eyes. Fresh vegetables, good meat, coffee that wasn't instant. Simple things that felt like miracles after weeks of vending machine dinners and convenience store meals. "It's nice," she said finally, the understatement of the century. Jake seemed to understand the weight behind her careful words. "Nice is good, nice is a start." Emma came racing out of the bedroom, sliding across the hardwood floor in her sock feet. "Jake, did you bring medicine for Dutch?" She's been making that sound again, the one that means her chest hurts. "I did indeed," Jake replied, holding up his veterinary kit. "Think she'll let me take a look at her? She likes you," Ella said, appearing in the doorway with Duchess cradled in her arms like a feathered babe. "She told me so, did she now? And what exactly did she say?" Ella's face scrunched up in concentration. "She said you smell like horses and kindness, and that's her favorite combination." Jake laughed, a rich sound that filled the apartment's corners and made Sarah realize how long it had been since she'd heard genuine laughter. "Well, I'm honored by her approval. Shall we see what's going on with her breathing?" The examination was gentle and thorough, Jake's large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he listened to Duchess's chest and examined her throat. The duck submitted to the process with remarkable patience, occasionally turning her head to watch Jake's face as if monitoring his finding. "Her respiratory system is compromised, but not critically," Jake explained as he worked. "Probably damage from her early illness that never fully healed. The scarf is actually a good idea, keeps her airways warm and reduces irritation." "The last vet said she might need surgery eventually," Sarah said, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "Maybe, but not anytime soon."
What she needs is consistent care, a stable environment, and medication to manage the inflammation. I can write you a prescription, and I know a feed store in the next county that carries the specialized duck feed she should be eating. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Prescriptions meant pharmacies, which meant insurance or cash she didn't have. Specialized feed meant staying in one place long enough to establish a routine. Both things implied a stability that felt impossible. "How much?" she asked quietly. Jake looked up from stroking Duchess's neck. "How much what?" "The medication. The examination. All of it." "Sarah, I told you, I know what you told me, but I need to know the real cost. I don't like owing people money I can't pay back." Jake set Duchess gently on the floor and studied Sarah's face. She could see him processing her reaction, trying to understand the fear behind her practical question. "The examination is free because Duchess is family now," he said finally. "The medication will cost about $15 a month. The specialized feed is maybe $20. If that's a problem, we can work something out. $35 a month for Duchess's care." Sarah did quick math in her head, calculating against the wages Jake had promised and the minimal expenses of living above the feed store. It was manageable, barely if nothing went wrong. "Okay," she said. "But I pay my own way, I wouldn't expect anything else." The girls had been listening to this exchange with the solemn attention children developed when money was a constant worry. Emma reached out to pet Duchess, who had settled on the rug with the satisfied air of someone who'd just received good news about her health. "Is she going to be okay?" Emma asked. "She's going to be fine," Jake assured her. "Especially if she keeps taking her medicine and wearing her fancy scarf." "She has 3 scarves," Ella announced proudly. "Red for regular days, blue for special occasions, and green for when she's feeling fancy." "A duck of impeccable fashion sense," Jake observed solemnly. "I respect that." Over the next week they settled into a routine that felt dangerous in its normalcy. Sarah would wake before dawn, the old habit of hypervigilance hard to break, and find Jake already at work in the feed store below. He never commented on her early rising or the way she positioned herself where she could see both entrances while they worked, but she noticed that he always left the front door unlocked until she came downstairs. The twins thrived in the structured environment. Emma discovered a talent for organizing, creating elaborate filing systems for the old receipts and invoices they found in every corner of the store. Ella gravitated toward the creative work, designing new labels for the boxes they packed and drawing pictures of Duchess to tape on containers that held duck-related supplies. Duchess herself had become something of a local celebrity. Word had spread through Cedar Falls about the duck in the red scarf, and people began stopping by the feed store just to catch a glimpse of her. She accepted the attention with regal grace, posing for photographs and allowing children to pet her feathers while maintaining the dignity befitting her station. Sarah watched these interactions with a mixture of pleasure and anxiety. The attention was harmless, even sweet, but it made her feel exposed. In her experience, being noticed was the first step toward being found, and being found meant running again. "You're doing it again," Jake said one afternoon as they sorted through a box of old farming magazines. Looking at the door like you're measuring the distance." Sarah's hands stilled on the magazine she'd been holding. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. Every time someone new comes into the store, every time a car drives by slowly, every time the phone rings, you calculate escape routes. I'm just wondering when you're going to trust that you don't need them. The directness of his observation caught her off guard. She'd grown skilled at reading people's motivations, at recognizing when kindness masked manipulation or when safety was an illusion designed to lower her defenses. But Jake's straightforwardness left her nowhere to hide. Trust is a luxury I can't afford, she said finally. Trust is a necessity you can't live without, he countered. Not really living anyway. Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the front door chimed, and Mrs. Henderson entered with her ancient basset hound and a covered pie plate. Sarah's muscles tensed automatically, but Jake just smiled and called out a greeting. Afternoon, Mrs. Henderson. How's Barney doing? Oh, you know Barney. Still convinced he's a puppy despite all evidence to the contrary. She set the pie on the counter and looked around the transformed space with approval. My goodness, you've made remarkable progress. This place looks better than it has in years. Sarah and the girls have been working hard, Jake said, giving credit where it was due. They've got a real talent for organization. Mrs. Henderson turned her attention to Sarah with the frank curiosity of someone who'd lived in a small town for 8 decades. You must be the young woman everyone's talking about. The one with the duck. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheek. I hope Duchess hasn't been causing problems. Problems? Heavens no, dear. She's the most excitement we've had in Cedar Falls since the Patterson boy drove his tractor into the fountain last spring. The children absolutely adore her. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Duchess appeared from behind the counter where she'd been supervising the twins' latest organizational project. She waddled over to Mrs. Henderson with the confidence of someone accustomed to admiration. Well, hello there, beautiful, Miss Henderson cooed, bending down to stroke Duchess's head. Aren't you just the most elegant thing? And that scarf is absolutely precious. She has 3 of them, Emma announced, appearing with her arms full of receipts sorted by year. We wash them in the sink upstairs and hang them on the line behind the store. How wonderfully domestic, Mrs. Henderson said with genuine delight. You girls are lucky to have such an unusual pet. She's not really a pet, Ella corrected seriously. She's family. Something in the way she said it, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd learned that family came in many forms, seemed to touch Mrs. Henderson. Her expression softened, and she looked at Sarah with understanding that went deeper than small-town curiosity. Of course she is, dear. The best families are the ones we choose, aren't they? After Mrs. Henderson left, taking her pie and her gentle wisdom with her, the store felt quieter. Sarah found herself thinking about chosen families and the way the old woman had looked at them. Not as strangers passing through but as people who belonged. She seems nice, Sarah said, testing the words. Mrs. Henderson is good people, Jake agreed. Lost her husband 2 years ago, never had children of her own. But she's claimed half the kids in town as honorary grandchildren. Makes sure everyone has what they need, whether they ask for it or not. Is that what this is? Sarah asked, the question escaping before she could stop. You making sure we have what we need? Jake looked up from the inventory list he'd been updating. Is that what you think? I don't know what to think. In my experience, people don't help strangers without wanting something in return. What do you think I want? Sarah considered the question seriously, studying his face for signs of hidden agenda. But all she saw was patience, and a kind of steady warmth that reminded her of summer afternoons and safety. I think maybe you're lonely, she said finally. And we're a convenient distraction. Jake was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Sarah wondered if she'd offended him. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. You're probably right about the lonely part. This place has been empty too long, and so have I. But you're not a distraction, Sarah. You're a reminder. Of what? That life is meant to be lived with other people, that taking care of each other isn't a burden, it's a privilege. Before Sarah could process this fully, the twins came running from the back room with Duchess trailing behind them, her latest scarf slightly disheveled from whatever adventure they'd been having. Jake, Emma called out breathlessly. We found something important, Ella added, bouncing on her toes with excitement. They led him to a corner of the storage room where they'd been organizing boxes of old inventory. Behind a stack of feed sacks, they'd discovered a small wooden chest with brass hinges and a faded red ribbon tied around. It was hidden, Emma explained. Like a treasure. Can we open it? Ella asked. We thought maybe we should ask first, in case it's special. Jake examined the chest, recognizing his grandmother's handiwork in the careful way the ribbon was tied. I think my grandmother left this for someone to find. Let's see what's inside. The chest contained a collection of items that told the story of Walter and Margaret Sullivan's life together. Letters tied with string, photographs from their courtship and early marriage.
a dried flower from Margaret's wedding bouquet, and a small journal filled with her neat handwriting. The twins looked through the photographs with the reverent attention, children reserved for glimpses into adult mysteries. Duchess investigated the chest itself, apparently finding the smell of old wood and memories interesting enough to warrant close inspection. Sarah found herself drawn to the journal, reading entries that chronicled the daily life of a marriage that had lasted 47 years. Margaret wrote about small things, Walter bringing her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, the way he sang off-key while doing chores, the pride in his voice when he talked about Jake's accomplishments. But she also wrote about harder things. Years when the store barely broke even, Margaret's 3 miscarriages before they accepted that children weren't in their future, Walter's struggle with depression after his brother died in Vietnam. Through it all, the constant thread was their commitment to each other and to the community they'd built around themselves. They'd made Cedar Falls a place where people could find what they needed, whether it was feed for their animals or a listening ear for their trouble. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Sarah said, closing the journal carefully. "She was," Jake agreed. "They both were. They made this place feel like home for a lot of people over the years, including you, especially me. I was 8 when my parents died, scared and angry and convinced the world was nothing but pain. They showed me different." Sarah understood the weight behind his words, the way childhood trauma could shape a person's entire worldview. She looked around the feed store, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just a business or even a home. It was a sanctuary, a place where broken things came to be mended. "Is that what you're trying to do for us?" she asked quietly. "Show us different?" Jake met her eyes, and Sarah saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity or charity or even simple kindness, but recognition. He saw her, really saw her, in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. "I'm trying to show you what you already know," he said. "That you're worth saving. That the girls are worth protecting. That even a duck with respiratory problems and a fashion sense deserves good care." That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, clutching their favorite photographs from Margaret's collection, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to make sense of the feelings churning in her chest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope made you careless, made you forget that safety was always temporary and kindness often came with a price. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, learned it so thoroughly that the knowledge lived in her bones like old pain. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her tense until she recognized Jake's careful tread. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his own mug of coffee, looking comfortable in the domestic scene despite the late hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "I don't sleep much anymore," Sarah admitted. "Old habit." Jake sat across from her at the small table, close enough that she could smell the soap he used and see the tired lines around his eyes. "Bad dreams, bad memories. They tend to visit at night when things get quiet. Want to talk about?" Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of prurient curiosity or the kind of helpful pushiness that came from people who thought talking about trauma was always healing. But Jake's expression held only patient concern, the same look she'd seen him wear when examining injured animals. "His name was Marcus," she said finally, the words coming out rusty from disuse. "The girl's father. We were together for 5 years before I realized what he was." Jake sipped his coffee and waited, giving her space to find the words at her own pace. "He was charming at first, the way they always are.
Swept me off my feet and made me feel special and protected. By the time I understood that his protection was really control, I was pregnant with the twins and completely isolated from everyone I'd known before." The familiar shame washed over her, the self-recrimination that lived alongside the memories. She should have seen the signs earlier. Should have been stronger, smarter, more suspicious of his overwhelming attention. "Controlling how?" Jake asked gently. "Everything. Where I went, who I talked to, what I wore, what I ate. He convinced me that the world was dangerous and he was the only one who could keep me safe. When the girls were born, it got worse. He said they needed protection too, that I couldn't be trusted to make good decisions for them." Sarah paused, remembering the way Marcus had made her doubt her own instincts, her own reality. The gaslighting had been so gradual, so expertly done, that she'd lost herself completely before she even realized she was disappearing. "He never hit me," she continued, anticipating Jake's next question. "That was the thing that made it so hard to understand what was happening. There were no bruises, no obvious signs, just this constant erosion of who I was, until I couldn't remember what I'd been like before him." "Emotional abuse is still abuse," Jake said quietly. "I know that now, but then I thought I was going crazy. He told me I was unstable, that I imagined things, that the girls would be better off without me if I didn't get my act together. The girl." Even now, the memory of Marcus's threats against Emma and Ella made Sarah's hands shake. He'd never hurt them directly, but the implication had always been there. "Behave, be grateful, don't question, Or else, what made you leave? Sarah's breath caught as she remembered that final terrible night 6 months ago. He brought home adoption papers, said he'd found a family who could give the girls a better life, that I was too damaged to be a proper mother. He wanted me to sign that. Jake's hand tightened around his coffee mug, but his voice remained steady. But you didn't. I couldn't, whatever else I'd lost, whatever he'd convinced me I was. I knew I loved those girls more than my own life. So I waited until he went to work the next morning, packed everything that would fit in 2 bags, and we ran. With Duchess. Sarah smiled despite the weight of her memories. With Duchess. Emma insisted. Said we couldn't leave family behind. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kitchen warm around them, and the night quiet beyond the windows. Sarah felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth aloud had released some of the poison she'd been carrying. He's looking for us, she said finally. That's why we can't stay anywhere long. He has money, connections, he's convinced everyone who'll listen that I kidnapped his children, that I'm mentally unstable and dangerous. But the girls aren't legally his, are they? If you were never married, he's on their birth certificate, has paternity papers, documentation of our relationship. And I look like exactly what he says I am, a desperate woman with no money, and no fixed address, traveling with stolen children. Jake leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Sarah watched his face, waiting for the moment when reality would set in, and he'd realized that helping her meant putting himself at risk. How did you find Duchess? He asked instead, surprising her with the change of subject. We were staying at a motel outside of Oklahoma City. The girls were playing in the parking lot while I tried to figure out our next move, and they heard this pitiful sound coming from the dumpster. Someone had thrown her away like garbage. Sarah remembered that day with perfect clarity. The twins' horror at finding the sick duckling, their absolute insistence that they couldn't leave her behind. It had been their first act of defiance against the learned helplessness Marcus had instilled in all of them. She was barely alive, respiratory infection, malnutrition, terrified of everything. But the girls just sat with her, talking to her like she was a person, and somehow she got better. They saved her. She saved us, really, gave us something to focus on besides running and hiding. The girls had to be responsible for another living thing, and that made them feel strong again. Jake smiled. And the scarves, Emma's idea. She noticed that Duchess shivered when it was cold, so she made her first scarf out of a sock. Then Ella decided it needed to be prettier, so she found some fabric at a thrift store. It became this whole project, making sure Duchess was comfortable and stylish. They're remarkable kids. They've been through more than any child should have to endure, but they still believe in goodness. Still trust that people can be kind. Unlike their mother, Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm working on it, I know you, and for what it's worth, I think you're doing better than you realize. The next morning brought the kind of autumn day that made Sarah understand why people wrote poetry about small towns. The air was crisp and clean, full of the scent of apple orchards and wood smoke. The maple trees lining Main Street had begun their transformation, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The twins had discovered the town's small park during one of their exploratory walks, and they begged Jake to take them there after lunch. Sarah found herself agreeing despite her usual reluctance to venture into public spaces, where they might be noticed and remembered. The park was busy with families enjoying the perfect weather. Children climbed on playground equipment while parents chatted on benches, everyone moving with the unhurried pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Duchess drew attention immediately, waddling across the grass in her blue scarf, with Emma and Ella, providing running commentary on her activities. That's Duchess, Emma explained to a little boy who'd approached to stare. She's a duck, but she thinks she's people. She wears scarves because she gets cold, Ella added helpfully. Today she's wearing blue because it's a special day. What makes it special? The boy asked, clearly fascinated. The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent twin conversations before Emma answered. We get to play in the park with our friend Jake. Friend Jake? Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the casual way they'd claimed him. In their world, people were either safe or unsafe, family or strangers. There was no middle ground, no casual acquaintance. Jake had somehow crossed the line from stranger to family without her noticing the exact moment it happened. She watched him push the twins on the swings, his large hands gentle as he adjusted their height and made sure they were secure. Other parents nodded at him in recognition, clearly comfortable with his presence around their children. Sarah realized that this was what belonging looked like, this easy integration into a community's daily rhythms. Your girls are adorable, a woman said, settling onto the bench beside Sarah. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke of someone who found joy in simple pleasures. Thank you, Sarah replied, automatically tensing at the unsolicited
I'm Linda Patterson, by the way. My son Tommy is the one interrogating your daughters about duck care. Sarah followed her gaze to where a sandy-haired boy was having an intense conversation with the twins about the proper way to knit scarves for waterfowl. They love talking about Duchess. She's quite the celebrity around here. My mother can't stop talking about the duck in the red scarf. Says it's the most interesting thing to happen in Cedar Falls since the bicentennial celebration. Despite her nervousness, Sarah found herself smiling. She does tend to make an impression. Jake says you're helping him clean out the old feed store. That's wonderful. The place has been empty too long. The casual mention of Jake's name, the assumption of Sarah's place in the community narrative, should have been alarming. Instead, it felt almost comforting to be discussed as part of the town's normal business, rather than as a curiosity or threat. It's good work, Sarah said carefully. Jake's been very generous with his time. He's a good man. Lost his wife a few years back, threw himself into his veterinary practice until we all worried he'd forgotten how to be around people. It's nice to see him smiling again. Sarah glanced across the playground to where Jake was indeed smiling, his face animated as he listened to whatever story Emma was telling. The realization that she might be responsible for that change in him felt overwhelming in its implication. We're not staying long, she said, the words coming out more abruptly than she'd intended. Linda looked at her with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd raised children and seen through their excuses for decades. Sometimes the places we're not planning to stay are the ones that end up keeping us. Before Sarah could respond, Tommy Patterson came running over with Duchess tucked securely in his arms and the twins trailing behind him. Mom, can we get a duck? Emma and Ella said, they're the best pets ever, and Duchess likes kids, and she's really smart, and she could teach me how to be responsible. Linda laughed, a sound full of maternal patience. Ducks are a big responsibility, Tommy. They need special care and lots of attention. But I could do it, and Jake could help me, right Jake? Tommy called across the playground. Jake approached with the diplomatic expression of someone who'd just been volunteered for duck consultation services. Ducks are wonderful, Tommy, but they're also a lot of work. Maybe you should start with something smaller, like a goldfish. Goldfish don't wear scarves, Tommy pointed out with impeccable logic. True, but they also don't require knitting skill. The easy banter continued as other children gathered around Duchess, who accepted the attention with regal composure. Parents drifted over to meet the famous duck and her unusual family, and Sarah found herself part of conversations about everything from respiratory care for waterfowl to the best places to buy specialty yarn for scarf making. It was exactly the kind of exposure she'd spent months avoiding, but somehow it felt safe here in the afternoon sunshine with Jake nearby, and the twins laughing as they demonstrated Duchess's tricks. For the first time since leaving Marcus, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere. The fantasy lasted until she spotted the black sedan parked across from the park entrance. The car was too clean, too expensive for Cedar Falls, with tinted windows that prevented her from seeing who was inside. But Sarah's survival instincts didn't need visual confirmation. Every nerve in her body screamed danger with the same intensity she'd learned to trust over the past 6 months. Jake, she said quietly, moving closer to him without taking her eyes off the car. Something in her voice must have communicated her fear, because his expression immediately became alert. What is it? We need to go. Now. Jake followed her gaze to the sedan, his jaw tightening as he processed the potential threat. Without argument or questions, he began gathering the twins with casual efficiency that wouldn't alarm them or the other families in the park. Time to head home, girl. Duchess looks tired, and we still have work to finish at the store. Emma and Ella protested mildly, but allowed themselves to be redirected toward the park's exit. Other parents called out goodbyes, and Tommy Patterson waved enthusiastically as they left. The picture of a normal family ending a pleasant afternoon in exactly the way hundreds of families did every day. The sedan's engine started as they reached the street. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as they walked back toward Main Street, forcing herself to maintain a normal pace when every instinct screamed at her to run. Jake kept the twins distracted with questions about their playground adventures, while staying alert to their surroundings in a way that told Sarah he understood the gravity of the situation. The car followed at a distance, never close enough to be obvious but never far enough away to provide real comfort. By the time they reached the feed store, Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key in the lock. Upstairs, Jake said quietly once they were in. All of you. Sarah needed no further encouragement. She ushered the twins toward the back stairs with Duchess trailing behind, her usual dignified waddle betraying nothing of the tension crackling through the air. Only when they were safely in the apartment with the door locked did Sarah allow herself to fall apart. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her entire body trembling with the adrenaline crash that always followed moments of acute danger. The twins looked between her and Jake with growing concern, sensing the adult fear they couldn't understand. Mama? Emma asked in a small voice. Are we in trouble? Sarah tried to find words that would be truthful without being terrifying, but Jake spoke first. Someone might be looking for you, he said gently, But you're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you or your mom or Duchess. Bad people, Ella whispered, moving closer to her sister. We don't know yet, Jake replied with careful honesty. But good people are going to make sure you stay safe. Sarah looked at him through her panic, seeing the quiet determination in his expression. He meant what he said, she realized. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to abandon them to face it alone. The knowledge should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a different kind of terror. Because accepting Jake's protection meant allowing him to put himself at risk for people he'd known for barely 2 weeks. It meant admitting that she couldn't handle this alone, that for all her fierce independence and carefully maintained walls, she needed help. But as the twins curled up on either side of her and Duchess settled protectively at their feet, Sarah realized that her needs had stopped being the only consideration the moment she'd become responsible for 3 other lives. If Marcus had found them, if the careful anonymity they'd maintained for months had finally been breached, then she had to make the hardest choice of all, whether to run again and keep everyone she cared about safe, or stay and fight with whatever allies she could find. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across Main Street, and somewhere in the growing darkness, a black sedan waited with patience that felt like a promise. The black sedan sat outside the feed store for 3 days, like a vulture waiting for carriage. Sarah watched it from the upstairs window, marking the driver changes at 8-hour intervals, noting the way they photographed everyone who entered or left the building. Professional surveillance, the kind that came with money and legal backing. Jake had called Sheriff Morrison on the first day, but the response had been predictably unhelpful. The car was parked legally on a public street, its occupants weren't bothering anyone, and without evidence of actual wrongdoing, there was nothing law enforcement could do except keep an eye on the situation.
They're waiting for me to run, Sarah told Jake on the 3rd morning as they watched the current driver sip coffee from a thermos. That's what Marcus does. Creates pressure until people make mistakes. Then we don't give him what he wants, Jake replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had become Sarah's anchor in the storm of her fear. We wait them out. But waiting was torture when every instinct screamed for flight. The twins sensed the tension despite Jake's efforts to maintain normalcy, becoming clingy and watchful in ways that broke Sarah's heart. Even Duchess seemed affected, staying closer to the family and making soft, worried sounds when left alone. The break came on Thursday morning when Jake answered a knock at the feed store's front door to find a woman in an expensive suit flanked by 2 Cedar Falls police officers. Sarah, who had been sorting through boxes in the back room with the twins, felt her blood turn to ice at the sound of unfamiliar voices. Mr. Sullivan, I'm Patricia Hoffman, attorney for Marcus Bennett. I believe you have my client's children on the premises. Sarah's hands began to shake. Marcus had found them, had somehow convinced authorities that his version of events was the truth. She pulled Emma and Ella closer, her mind already calculating escape routes and contingency plans that felt hopeless in their inadequacy. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Jake replied, but his voice carried none of its usual warmth. Sarah Mitchell, also known as Sarah Bennett, is wanted for custodial interference and child endangerment. She fled Minnesota 6 months ago with my client's twin daughters and has been evading law enforcement since. We have reason to believe she's been staying here under false pretenses. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear one of the police officers shifting uncomfortably. Ma'am, we're here as a courtesy, but we'll need to see some kind of court order before, of course. The sound of papers rustling. Emergency custody order from Hennepin County, Minnesota. Mr. Bennett is the girl's legal father and has been frantically searching for his children since their mother's psychological breakdown. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Psychological breakdown. The careful documentation of her supposed instability, the narrative Marcus had crafted to explain away her desperate flight. She could picture him in his expensive suit, playing the role of concerned father to perfection. Jake, she whispered, emerging from the back room with the twins pressed against her sides. It's okay, I won't let them take the girls. Patricia Hoffman's expression shifted to predatory satisfaction when she saw Sarah. Miss Mitchell, or do you prefer Bennett? You've led us quite a chase. The girls aren't going anywhere, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Whatever Marcus told you, whatever lies he's constructed, I won't let him hurt them. Hurt them? Miss Bennett, your ex-partner has done nothing but worry about his daughter's welfare. You disappeared in the middle of the night with no word, no contact, exposing 2 small children to homelessness and instability. That hardly seems like the actions of a loving mother. Emma stepped forward, her small chin lifted with defiance that reminded Sarah painfully of herself at that age. Marcus isn't our daddy, he was mean to Mama. Children often have difficulty understanding adult relationships. Patricia replied smoothly. That's why the courts exist, to protect their best interests when parents can't agree. Show me the DNA test, Jake said subtly, his veterinarian's mind cutting through the legal rhetoric to the biological facts. If this man claims to be their father, prove it.
Patricia's confident smile faltered slightly. Miss Bennett is listed on their birth certificates. Birth certificates can be falsified. DNA doesn't lie. Sarah felt a spark of hope. In her panic during those final days with Marcus, she'd never thought to question his legal relationship to the girls. But Jake was. If Marcus had no biological claim to Emma and Ella, his entire case would crumble. The custody order is valid regardless, Patricia said, but her tone had lost some of its certainty. Miss Bennett has been declared an unfit mother by the state of Minnesota, based on what evidence? Jake pressed. Her ex-boyfriend's word? Where are the police reports, the social services investigations, the documented incidents that would support such a drastic ruling? One of the police officers, a young man Sarah recognized from her trips to the grocery store, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the proceedings. Ma'am, maybe we should wait for Sheriff Morrison before. There's no need to wait, Patricia interrupted. The order is clear. The children are to be remanded to Mr. Bennett's custody immediately. Over my dead body, Sarah said quietly, and meant it. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, and what appeared to be half the population of Cedar Falls. They came in groups of 2 and 3, filling the feed store with the quiet solidarity of people who had decided where their loyalties lay. What's all this commotion? Miss Henderson asked with the innocent curiosity of someone who had definitely not been coordinating with her neighbors through a telephone tree that had been active since dawn. Legal matter, Patricia replied tersely. Nothing that concerns. Oh, but it does concern us, interrupted Tom Patterson, Linda's husband and the town's only lawyer. When someone comes into our community making accusations against our people, that's very much our concern. Patricia's professional composure began to crack as more residents filed into the store. The postmaster, the librarian, the owner of the diner, the high school principal, even some of the teenagers had shown up, including Tommy Patterson, who immediately went to comfort Duchess. This is highly irregular, Patricia protested. We're conducting official business here. So are we, said Sheriff Morrison, pushing through the crowd with the unhurried authority of someone who had been keeping the peace in Cedar Falls for 37 years. And I'd like to see that custody order you're waving around. Patricia handed over the documents with visible reluctance. Sheriff Morrison read them carefully, his weathered face showing nothing as he absorbed the legal language. Minnesota, huh? He said finally. Long way from home. What brings you all the way to Colorado? Following a fugitive who has kidnapped 2 children. Alleged fugitive, Tom Patterson corrected mildly. And I noticed this order was issued ex parte, without Miss Mitchell having the opportunity to present her side of the story. She fled the jurisdiction. She left the state with her own children. That's not the same thing as fleeing jurisdiction, especially when no charges have been filed. Sarah watched the legal maneuvering with growing amazement. These people, her neighbors who had known her for less than a month, were closing ranks around her and the twins with the fierce protectiveness of family defending their own. Furthermore, Tom continued, pulling out his own set of papers, I've taken the liberty of filing a motion with the Cedar Falls Municipal Court requesting an emergency hearing on this matter. Pending that hearing, I don't believe Miss Mitchell or her children should be compelled to go anywhere. Patricia's face flushed with anger. You can't supersede a valid court order with local procedural delays. Actually, I can, Sheriff Morrison said cheerfully. Colorado law gives me considerable discretion in matters involving the welfare of minor children. And something about this whole situation smells fishy to me. As if summoned by the word fishy, Duchess waddled into the middle of the crowd wearing her green scarf and surveying the proceedings with regal displeasure. Several people smiled despite the tension, and Tommy Patterson immediately scooped her up for protective cuddling. Is that a duck? Asked the younger police officer, clearly struggling to maintain professional composure. That's Duchess, Emma said proudly. She wears scarves, Ella added helpfully. Because she gets cold. The absurdity of the moment seemed to break something in Patricia's carefully constructed facade. This is ridiculous. We're talking about a serious legal matter, not some small-town circus. Ma'am, Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying a warning that made Sarah think of steel wrapped in velvet. You're a guest in my town. I suggest you remember that. The confrontation might have escalated further if not for the arrival of a final unexpected player. The feed store door opened to admit a man in his 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a collar that identified him as clergy. Pastor Williams, Mrs. Henderson said with obvious relief. Thank goodness you're here. Wouldn't miss it, the pastor replied, moving to stand beside Sarah with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to providing sanctuary. I understand there's some question about the welfare of these children. And you are? Patricia demanded. David Williams, pastor of Cedar Falls Community Church, also a licensed family counselor and court-appointed child advocate. He smiled at the twins, who had moved closer to their mother as the adult tension escalated. How are you girls doing? This must be scary for you. We're okay, Emma said with the bravery of someone who had learned to protect others from her own fear. Jake and Mama are taking care of us. And Duchess, Ella added, reaching out to stroke the duck's feathers. She's very protective. Pastor Williams nodded seriously. I can see she seems like a very responsible duck. This is absurd, Patricia snapped. A duck cannot be considered relevant to child custody proceedings. Perhaps not, Pastor Williams agreed mildly, but the care and love these children show for a vulnerable creature certainly speaks to the quality of parenting they've received. He turned to Sarah, his expression gentle, but serious. I wonder if you might be willing to speak with me privately about your concerns regarding Mr. Bennett. Sometimes it helps to have an objective third party evaluate these situations. Sarah looked around the feed store, taking in the faces of people who had chosen to stand with her despite knowing almost nothing about her past. Jake caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. Yes, she said quietly. I'd like that very much. The emergency hearing took place the following Monday in the Cedar Falls Municipal Court, a small room above the post office that normally handled traffic violations and property disputes. But there was nothing normal about the proceedings that unfolded as Tom Patterson presented Sarah's case with the thoroughness of someone who had spent the weekend becoming an expert in interstate custody law. The evidence was damning. Medical records documenting Sarah's injuries that Marcus had explained away as accidents. Financial records showing his systematic control of her resources. Testimony from the twins' pediatrician expressing concern about their fearful behavior during visit. Most importantly, DNA test results proving that Marcus Bennett had no biological relationship to Emma and Ella whatsoever. Patricia Hoffman fought hard, painting Sarah as an unstable woman who had manipulated the situation to gain sympathy. But her arguments crumbled under the weight of documentation and the steady testimony of Cedar Falls residents who had observed the family's integration into their community. The judge, borrowed from the county courthouse for the occasion, listened to everything with the patience of someone who had presided over enough custody disputes to recognize truth when she heard it. In the matter of Bennett versus Mitchell, she said finally, I find no grounds for the emergency custody order issued in Minnesota. The children will remain with their mother pending a full investigation into Mr. Bennett's allegations. Sarah felt her knees give out with relief. Jake caught her before she could fall, his strong arms providing the support she needed to remain standing as the legal machinery that had threatened to destroy her family ground to a halt. But the real victory came 3 months later, when the Minnesota court formally dismissed all charges against Sarah and issued a restraining order against Marcus Bennett. The investigation Tom Patterson had insisted upon revealed a pattern of manipulation and abuse that extended far beyond Sarah's case, leading to criminal charges that would keep Marcus busy with his own legal problems for years to come. By then, Sarah and the twins had settled into Cedar Falls with the permanence of people who had found their place in the world. Emma and Ella started school, where they quickly became popular for their stories of life on the road and their unusual family pet. Duchess became the unofficial mascot of the elementary school, visiting classrooms to help children learn about responsibility and the care of vulnerable creatures. Sarah took over management of the feed store, transforming it into a combination agricultural supply and community gathering place that Walter Sullivan would have recognized and approved of. She and Jake married on a crisp October afternoon with the twins as flower girls and Duchess as ring bearer, her specially embroidered wedding scarf drawing applause from the assembled guests. The apartment above the store became their first home together, filled with the cheerful chaos of blended family life. Jake's veterinary practice expanded to include exotic pet care, partly due to his growing expertise in waterfowl medicine. Duchess never did swim in his coffee, but she did develop a fondness for stealing bacon from his breakfast plate when she thought no one was looking. On quiet evenings when the girls were asleep and Duchess was preening her feathers by the window, Sarah and Jake would sit together on the front porch and watch the sun set over Main Street. Sometimes they talked about the past, the winding roads that had brought them together. More often they planned for the future, discussing everything from expanding the store to whether Duchess might accept a companion duck. No regrets? Jake asked one evening as they watched Mrs. Henderson walk past with her ancient basset hound. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the woman she had been 6 months ago, frightened and running with no destination except away. That woman could never have imagined the life she was living now, the deep contentment that came from belonging somewhere complete. Just one, she said finally. Jake looked at her with concern. What's that? Sarah smiled and reached for his hand. I regret that it took me so long to realize that home isn't a place you find. It's something you build with people who choose to stay. As if in agreement, Duchess made a soft sound from her perch by the window. In the gathering darkness, her latest scarf glowed softly, a beacon of warmth and safety in a world that had finally learned to welcome the unusual and celebrate the different. The duck still didn't swim in Jake's coffee, but she had mastered the art of belonging, which turned out to be far more important. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.